Over the years in Formula One, we've seen many generational talents come through the ranks together and get into the top category of motorsport as a part of a group of drivers. Probably the most notable recent example of this is the 2018 class of British rookies who graduated from Formula 2, those being George Russell, Lando Norris and Alex Albon. However, nearly 6 years on from their debut, only 2 of those have actually won a race, never mind a championship. Admittedly, not all circumstances are their fault, but considering they're one of the most talented rookie classes of the last few years, you'd have expected more by now. Fans of F1 in the late 1990s and early 2000s will remember the battles that Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen had, and conveniently, those two both debuted in 1991. Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel both made their Grand Prix debuts in 2007, and combined with Heikki Kovalainen's single triumph, they combine as the most successful set of new drivers in F1 history in terms of wins, having racked up a staggering 157 victories between them. One of the most prevalent things about talented rookie classes going back to the 1980s is that they had at maximum 3 world-class drivers. 2001 saw Fernando Alonso, Kimi Raikkonen and Juan Pablo Montoya make their debuts, but 3 legendary drivers doesn't really cut it for me. Rookie classes in motorsports, especially from earlier eras, are harder to quantify as part-time campaigns were way more common back in the day than they are now. Therefore, I'm going to use my own discretion to include some drivers in the 1970 rookie class who may have competed in F1 sporadically before, but established themselves in 1970. The perfect example of a driver I'll let in despite technically not debuting in the year 1970 is François Cevert. The Frenchman did only 1 race for the Techno team in the 1969 German Grand Prix on the Nürburgring Nordschleife using an F2 car before embarking on his first full-time campaign the year after. I think it would be stupid to discount Cevert based off of 1 race he wasn't even eligible for points in, so I'll use my judgment to allow certain drivers into this special rookie class even if they started their F1 career before 1970 technically. From my calculations, 10 drivers whose F1 careers began in the year 1970 went on to achieve at least 1 podium in their career. Admittedly, that doesn't sound like a lot, but the next part is better. Of the 6 race winners on that list, 5 of them either won a World Drivers' Championship or had the potential to win one. 4 other drivers on that podium list achieved only 1 rostrum in their entire career, all of which were 3rd places. Tim Schenken, René Wiesel, Rolf Stommelen and Henri Pescarolo all have interesting stories when it comes to motor racing. Schenken entered F1 in 1970 after winning the 1968 British Formula 3 and Formula Ford titles, then won the French Formula 3 series in 1969. His sole podium came in the 1971 Austrian Grand Prix, where he finished 3rd, but he only scored 2 other points finishes in his entire career, having taken 6th place in the 1971 German Grand Prix, the race before his podium, and then he took 5th in the first race of 1972 in Buenos Aires. After a sparse rest of his 1972 campaign, he only drove 1 race in 1973 before doing 9 races in 1974 for the Trojan and Lotus teams. Outside of F1, Schenken did get 2nd place at the 1976 24 Hours of Le Mans, driving a Porsche 934 GT class car, but his F1 career remains forgotten by most people to this day. Another of the one-time podium finishers, René Wiesel, made his F1 debut at the 1970 United States Grand Prix as Lotus scrambled to find drivers to replace the deceased Jochen Rindt and John Miles, who had retired from F1 in the aftermath of the Austrian's death. His sole rostrum came at his first race attempt, where he finished 3rd, only behind Emerson Fittipaldi and the BRM of Pedro Rodriguez. He stayed with Lotus into 1971, scoring 2 4th places in Kyalami and the Österreichring, a 5th in Mosport and a 6th in Paul Ricard. However, subsequent moves to BRM in 1972, then to March in 1973, failed to achieve any good results, and he retired from racing after his home race at Sweden in 1974. Meanwhile, the surname Pescarolo is more affiliated with sports cars and endurance racing than it is with Formula 1, but Henri started his full-time F1 career in 1970 after finishing runners-up in the 1968 European Formula 2 series and finishing 4th in the same series in 1969. He drove 2 races for Matra in F1 in 1968, then competed in the 1969 German Grand Prix driving an F2 car and finished 5th, although because he was driving F2 machinery, he wasn't eligible for the 2 points offered for 5th place. He signed on full-time with the Matra Works team in 1970, and after a 7th place in South Africa and engine failure in Spa, he got his only career podium with 3rd place in Monaco. He then finished 6th in the last F1 race held on the old Spa-Francorchamps circuit before it was dropped from the calendar due to safety concerns. Pescarolo scored points twice more that year in Sherrard and Hockenheim with 5th and 6th respectively, but for 1971 he signed on with the Frank Williams Racing Cars team, running March chassis throughout the season. After a pointless first 5 races, he finished 4th in Silverstone after a duel with Rolf Stommelen, then finished 6th in Austria. However, he failed to score any points in 1972 and only ran sporadically in 1973, then signed on with a declining BRM team for 1974, which saw him get a best result of 9th in Argentina. Pescarolo sat out the 1975 F1 season, but returned for one last hurrah in the second half of 1976, driving for BS Fabrications. Although the team name sounded like it's actually a satirical newspaper, he drove to a best result of 9th at the Österreichring. Despite Henri failing to score any points post-1971, he enjoyed much success in endurance racing, particularly in the Le Mans 24-hour race, where he won his class 6 times and the outright race 4 times, including getting 3 in a row between 1972 and 74. His last Le Mans class win came in 1992 at the remarkable age of 50, and while his F1 career may not have been successful, he definitely had a good time at Le Mans. After winning his class at Le Mans in 1966, then finishing runners-up in 67 and 68, Rolf Stommelen made his F1 debut at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife driving a Lotus F2 chassis and finished 8th, then made his full-time debut with Brabham in 1970. His season kicked off in the 4th round of the season in Spa as he scored a 5th place position. He scored another 5th place position at Hockenheim, then finished 3rd on the podium in Austria behind Jack Yeix and Clay Regazzoni's Ferraris. Another 5th place in Monza was Stommelen's last points finish of 1970, putting him 11th in the driver's standings on 10 points. He stayed on with Brabham in 1971 but had a far less fruitful season, only scoring 3 points thanks to a 6th place in Monaco and 5th in Silverstone. After driving for the unsuccessful Eifeland team in 1972, the rest of Stommelen's career was taking part-time drives. He drove 4 races for Brabham at the back end of 1973, with the best result of 11th at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, then in 1974 drove for Graham Hill's team in the final 4 races. He got a best result of 11th in Mosport, which was good enough to stay on for the first part of 1975. He got 7th in the 3rd round of the season in Kyalami, then at the 4th race in Spain, Stommelen found himself in the lead. However, on lap 26, the German lost control of his car, speared into the barrier, then darted over to the other side of the circuit and landed on top of another barrier. Due to the poor upkeep of the Armco before and during the race weekend, they capsized when Stommelen's car went on top of it, and this crushed 4 spectators, killing them. Stommelen also had injuries, which saw him miss 7 races before returning for the Austrian and United States Grand Prix at the end of the season. 1976 saw him take up sports car racing, but he also did a handful of races for Brabham and Team Hesketh, and he scored a point for 6th place at the last race on the Nürburgring Nordschleife. After taking a break from F1 in 1977, he returned in 78 driving for Arrows alongside a young Riccardo Patrese. The Italian scored 11 points, including a 2nd place in Anderstorp, but Stommelen's best result were 2 9th places. He also failed to qualify twice and failed to pre-qualify 3 times. That was the end of Stommelen's F1 career, but he continued in endurance racing until 1983 when he was killed in a 6-hour race at Riverside. He was 39. With all the one-time podium sitters out of the way, let's get into the race winners of the 1970 rookie class. The only one of these, who I didn't believe had potential to win a Formula 1 World Championship, is Peter Geffen. Geffen raced in European Formula 2 in 1967 and 68, but only ever scored 1 points finish with a 3rd place in Vallelunga in 68. He won European F5000 in 1969 and took a consecutive championship in 1970 while making his F1 debut for McLaren. He replaced Bruce McLaren, who had died at Goodwood earlier in the year, and he impressed during his first race in Zandvoort, but he crashed out. After 3 more races, Geffen scored his first point in Mont Tremblant at the Canadian Grand Prix, but following a bad first 2/3 of the 1971 season, McLaren dropped him after the race on the Nürburgring Nordschleife, and he joined BRM for the rest of the year. After getting 10th at the Österreichring, he qualified 11th in Monza. However, due to the fast layout of the circuit, the racing product was very different to normal F1 races of the time. The track had 3 braking zones, only 2 of which were heavy ones, and so cars broke off into high-speed packs while slipstreaming each other. Geffen tagged on to the back of the leading pack, which contained 7 cars, which became 5 as Chris Amon and Joe Siffert fell back. and Peter exchanged the lead with Ronnie Peterson and Mike Halewood, while Francois Sever and Howden Ganley stayed in touch. Peterson crossed the line in the lead going on to the final lap, but as they came to the checkered flag, the Swede and Geffen were neck and neck. They crossed the line together, with the chasing trio close behind. It was Geffen who edged it, 0.01 seconds ahead, having raised his arm outside the cockpit in celebration in an attempt to persuade the officials he had won in the event of timing equipment putting the pair equal. Nonetheless, Geffen's season, which up to that point had no points, never mind podiums or victories, now had something on the board. He was 14th in Mosport, then 9th at Watkins Glen in the final 2 races, and an otherwise barren campaign now had a fantastic result put right in the middle. He remained at BRM for 1972, but the first 9 events didn't see him reach the checkered flag. 5 retirements, only one of which wasn't mechanically induced, 1 non-classified finish in Kyalami, a did not start in the last French Grand Prix held at Girard, and a non-arrival at the German race on the Nordschleife, and then a 13th place in Austria. However, a year after his shock win, at the 10th round in Monza, he took his only points finish of the season, with 6th place, before retiring at both of the final 2 events, in Canada and the USA. While his teammate Jean-Pierre Beltoise had taken his own shock victory in Monaco in the wet, Geffen had failed to impress and only did one F1 race in 1973, focusing more on other series, with his one entry in Canada ending in retirement. His last Formula 1 start came at Brands Hatch in 1974, driving for Graham Hill's driver-owner team, but he again failed to finish. He was undoubtedly one of the least likely Grand Prix winners of his era, as it took for an abnormal, slipstreaming race for him to see any success. He only scored points 3 times across his 5 seasons, and outside of his win, only had a highest finish of 2 6th places. He definitely didn't have championship winning potential, but he's the only race winner from the rookie class of 1970 that didn't have potential for greatness. The next driver is the one who I mentioned briefly earlier. Born in 1944, Frenchman Francois Sever was the son of a jeweller, and he began his motorsport career on 2 wheels instead of 4, racing his mum's Vespa scooter against his friends. Then he bought his own Norton bike aged 19. After completing his national military service, he began his career properly attempting to be a race car driver, attending training courses at Le Mans and the famous Winfield Racing School. He won a scholarship and a prize of an Alpine Formula 3 car and spent his first year in French Formula 3 in 1967, but lacked the funds and experience to be able to make the most of his machinery. He traded in his prized chassis for a more competitive Techno one once he'd secured sponsorship for 1968, and he won several races in his new car, and beat future F1 race winner Jean-Pierre Jabouille to the title. This performance brought him a works drive with the Techno F2 outfit in 1969, and he finished 3rd in the standings, taking a win at the Tulln Langenbahn airfield circuit in Austria, as well as taking part in the German Grand Prix on the Nürburgring Nordschleife, although still driving his lower tier machinery. He was the 2nd fastest qualifier of the F2 drivers, but had mechanical failure during the race. However, he'd given a good impression of himself during the year, particularly at a race at the Crystal Palace circuit, where he'd managed to keep incumbent Formula 1 champion Jackie Stewart at bay, a performance which led the Scot to recommend Sever to his team owner Ken Tyrrell. He partook in a 2nd year of Formula 2, winning again at the Austrian airport track, but made his full-time F1 debut at Zandvoort for Tyrrell following the sudden retirement of fellow Frenchman Johnny Servoz-Gavan, who felt the risks involved with Grand Prix racing at the time were far too high. It was initially believed that Sever's signing came about due to the team's sponsorship deal with the oil company Elf, but Ken Tyrrell later said that it was Stewart's recommendation that tipped the balance. After qualifying 15th in the Netherlands on his debut, he had engine failure on lap 31. He finished 11th on his home track in Girard, then took consecutive 7th places at Brands Hatch and Hockenheim. Another engine failure at the Österreichring was followed by his first points finish when he took 6th in Monza. Then he rounded off his 2/3 of the maiden season with 9th in Mont-Tremblant and a pair of retirements in Watkins Glen and Mexico City. He started 1971 by failing to score in any of the first 4 rounds, retiring in 3 due to accidents and finishing 7th in Montjuic Park. Then he took his first F1 podium at Paul Ricard, finishing as the runner-up, half a minute behind lead driver Stewart. 10th in Silverstone preceded another 2nd place at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, where he also set the fastest lap. He had an engine failure in Austria, got 3rd in Monza, then 6th in Canada, before the final race of the year in Watkins Glen. He qualified 5th, half a second away from his pole-sitting teammate, but quickly made his way into the lead by lap 13 as Stewart's tyres went off in the 37°C heat. Sever started struggling with the same understeer problems at about half distance, which allowed Ferrari's Jackie Ickx to close to 2.2 seconds behind by lap 43 of 59. 6 laps later though, Ixa's alternator fell off and punched a hole in his gearbox, spilling oil onto the track. 1967 champion Denny Hulme spun on the slip hazard, hitting the barrier and damaging his suspension. Then Sever also slid into the barrier but managed to continue. Francois eventually took the win by 40 seconds to Joe Siffert in second, picking up $50,000 in prize money and becoming only the second French race winner in F1 history, 13 years after Maurice Trintignant took his last triumph in the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix. Sever finished third in the year's standings, only behind his team leader Stewart and Ronnie Peterson. Tyrrell's fortunes fell in 1972 as he lost both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships to Emerson Fittipaldi and Lotus. Francois scored points only thrice, although 2 of those finishers were second places at Nivelles Ballers and Watkins Glen. He did also finish second at the Le Mans 24 Hours race, losing out to Graham Hill, who achieved motorsport's Triple Crown by winning that event. I covered Hill's career in a separate video, if you'd like to check it out on the top right corner of your screen. Back to Sever though, he was on it in 1973. He finished second to Fittipaldi at the opening round in Buenos Aires. Then after 2 non-scores in Interlagos and Kyalami, he finished second twice in Montjuic Park and Zolder, where he took the fastest lap in the latter. 4th in Monaco was followed by 3rd in Anderstorp, 2nd in Paul Ricard and 5th in Silverstone. He took his 6th and 7th second places of the season in Zandvoort and the Nordschleife, which put him a provisional runners-up in the driver's standings. Then a suspension failure in Austria preceded a 5th place in Monza before a collision on the 32nd lap of the Canadian Grand Prix with Jody Scheckter again put him into retirement. Going into the final race of the year, Stewart had won his 3rd championship crown and planned to retire at the conclusion of the race at Watkins Glen. Sever was to become the #1 driver at Tyrrell after his impressive form had seen him match and at times beat his mentor on pure pace. However, this plan was thrown into disarray on the Saturday qualifying session when the Frenchman crashed going through the S's. He'd debated with his teammate during the weekend what gear to take that complex of corners in, with the Scot opting to use 4th as it made the car less twitchy. His young adversary instead believed that there was an advantage to be gained by using 3rd gear thanks to the improved throttle response it gave, but this belief became his undoing as the crash he had was very severe. He'd hit the barrier on the left side of the track at a 90-degree angle without any protection as the nose of his car had caved in from contact with the wall on the other side. I won't detail his full injuries so I don't get demonetised, but it was a fatal accident that claimed the life of one of the most skilled up-and-coming drivers of his era. Sever was 29 years old when he died, and while the Tyrrell team's performance dipped in the following years, there's no doubt in mine and many others' minds that he could have gone somewhere else and won a championship or 2. His death wasn't in vain though, as along with Helmut Koenig, who died at the same track in similar circumstances a year later, it forced F1 to reduce speeds going through the S's until safety barrier technology caught up with the speed of the cars, as it remained in place until Watkins Glen fell off the calendar for financial reasons post-1980. Francois was the first driver I've covered in this video, who was part of the 1970 rookie class, who had championship winning potential, and I've put him here because of the fact that he has the least wins of those yet to come, but he's most certainly not forgotten by those versed in Formula 1 of this era. With his Hollywood star good looks and super skills, seeing him fight for a title with someone like James Hunt would be potentially even more tantalising than what actually transpired in his 1976 campaign. However, it's Hunt's eternal adversary Niki Lauda's first F1 teammate who is the next talent I'm going to cover, and that is the Swiss, Clay Regazzoni. Regazzoni had driven in European Formula 2 in 1968 and 69 and started the 1970 season in the same series well, winning at the second round in Hockenheim and taking 2nd place at the 4th race in Rouen. Despite this, his F1 journey began right there, as Ferrari needed a second driver to partner Jackie Ickx. From the 4th round in Belgium, he alternated the seat with a young Italian Ignazio Giunti, and Regazzoni made his Grand Prix debut at Zandvoort, finishing 4th. Giunti raced at Sherrard, but Clay took the seat full-time from there on in. In what was a very strange season, a topic I've covered in full in another video in the top right corner of your screen, Clay had a fantastic final 7 races of the year. After finishing 4th in Brands Hatch, then retiring on the Nordschleife, he took his first career podium on the Österreich-Ring in Austria before winning the Italian Grand Prix for his team's home race in only his 5th Grand Prix start. 2nd in Mont Tremblant was followed by 13th and 7 laps down in Watkins Glen, but he took pole position and finished in 2nd at the season finale in Mexico City. Despite only doing 2/3 of the season, Regazzoni finished in 3rd place in the driver's standings, and had he completed the full year, wouldn't have been an extremely wayward shout to become a debutant champion. His 1971 campaign was less successful as the Scarlet team was blighted with mechanical problems, as Regazzoni retired from 7 of the 11 events that made up the World Championship. In the 4 remaining rounds, he scored 3 third places in Kyalami, Zandvoort and the Nürburgring Nordschleife and a 6th place in Watkins Glen, showing he was still incredibly fast. He remained a staple of F1 throughout the 1970s as he remained with Ferrari in 72, although he only scored 2 podiums, with 3rd in Jarama and runners-up in another good result at the German Grand Prix. Then in 1973, at BRM, he was teammate to Niki Lauda, who followed him to Ferrari for 1974, where he took his first win since his debut campaign at the Green Hell. However, it was his ruthless consistency that took him to the final round of the year in Watkins Glen, level on points with Emerson Fittipaldi, but could unfortunately only finish 11th on race day, while the Brazilian took 4th place and the driver's title. Regazzoni took 2 more wins for the Maranello team, including at Monza in 1975 and a Grand Slam at the 1976 Long Beach race. Then he moved to the smaller teams of Ensign, then Shadow in 1977 and 78 respectively, scoring a best result of 4 fifth places across those 2 years. He then joined Williams just as they became a competitive force in 1979 and took the team's first win in Silverstone, along with 2nd places in Monaco and Hockenheim and 3rds in consecutive races in Monza and the Ile Notre Dame circuit in Montreal. He moved back to Ensign in 1980, but at the 4th round in Long Beach, he lost the brakes on his car, hit a parked car, then hit a concrete barrier at 150 miles an hour, which gave him damage to his spine. This put an end to his F1 career, and while Regazzoni may have already been 40 by the time of his career-ending crash, he nonetheless couldn't end on his own terms. He had took 5 wins across his decade in Formula 1 and drove for 2 of the most successful teams in the history of the sport, as well as being one of the most successful drivers from his nation. He was definitely one of the top 10 drivers of the 1970s too, but unfortunately never won a championship. Another extremely fast talent who was never able to claim a crown in Formula 1 was the Swede Ronnie Peterson. He competed in karting, making his way up to the top European series before making his car racing debut in Swedish Formula 3 in 1968, aged 24. He won the series in its entirety, then did so again in 1969, before moving up to F1 in 1970. He drove for a privateer outfit running March chassis starting at the 3rd round in Monaco, but a lack of testing time meant he could only qualify 12th out of 16 cars. He finished 7th on his debut, but that was as good as it got for the rest of the year, as his next best result was 9th in Zandvoort and Brands Hatch, and his only other finish was 11th in Watkins Glen. He failed to reach the checkered flag in 4 of the 9 events of the year, but had impressed enough to be signed by the Works March team for 1970. He was 10th and 2 laps down at the opening race in South Africa, driving the unique T-Tray designed 711, then had ignition issues at Montjuic Park. At Monaco, he took his first career points and podium by finishing in 2nd place, then was 4th in Zandvoort, before retiring in the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard. He was 2nd in Silverstone, then 5th on the Nürburgring Nordschleife, but struggled to 8th in the Austrian race on the Österreichring. The last 3 races of 1971 saw Peterson come 2nd in Monza and Mosport, then 3rd in the last event of the year in Watkins Glen. He finished runners-up in a Drivers' Championship thanks to his ruthless consistency, albeit with just over half the points of winner Jackie Stewart, but nonetheless impressed in his sophomore year, despite not winning any races. 1972 was a struggle, as although he scored points 5 times, only 1 of those was a podium. His 3rd place on the Nordschleife was supported by 4th in the United States, 5th in Kyalami and Sherrard, and 6th in Buenos Aires, but at the end of the season, he decided to switch to the Lotus team for 1973. He had oil pressure problems at the first race of the year in Argentina, then qualified on pole in Interlagos before retiring on lap 5 with wheel trouble. 11th in South Africa was followed by a gearbox failure at the Spanish Grand Prix while he was leading from pole position with the fastest lap, then he retired from pole again in Zolder. His luck began to turn in Monaco when he was 3rd, then at his home race in Anderstorp, he led from the front again, just like he had done before. He was at the front of a Team Lotus 1-2, but after his teammate Emerson Fittipaldi had mechanical problems, Denny Hulme assumed 2nd and began closing as Peterson struggled with tyre wear. Hulme overtook the Swede, who had been leading on home turf, on the final lap, eventually winning by 4 seconds with Ronnie in the runners-up slot. He'd come agonisingly close to his first triumph, having finished 2nd 5 times, as well as having 3 pole positions to his name. He was running 3rd at Paul Ricard behind Jody Scheckter and Emerson Fittipaldi when the pair collided on lap 42 of 54, and he stormed through to take his first F1 win after coming close so many times previously. Then in Silverstone, Ronnie initially lost the lead to Jackie Stewart off the line from pole, but the race was restarted when Scheckter caused another crash, this time involving 9 cars instead of just 2. Peterson led until lap 38, when American driver Peter Revson took over and won while the Swede finished second again. He took pole position by half a second in Zandvoort and led with fastest lap until his engine failed on the 66th tour of the circuit. Despite taking the first spot on the grid in 6 of the first 10 events of 1973, he'd only won one race, but after a retirement in Germany, he won the Austrian Grand Prix after losing the lead in the middle portion of the race to Emerson Fittipaldi. He won from pole in Monza, having led every lap, which shot him up into contention for second in the standings, and led the early stages in Mosport again from pole before his suspension failed on lap 16. However, in the season finale weekend that was overshadowed by the death of Francois Sever, Peterson took another near Grand Slam in Watkins Glen, only missing the fastest lap. He took third place in the standings away from the dead Tyrrell driver, but it should have been so much more for the Swede. He took 9 pole positions from the 15 rounds, and although he took 4 wins, he retired from another quartet of events that he could have won in. If unlucky second places in his home race in Silverstone went his way, we could have been looking at a 10-win season, and he could have nearly doubled his points tally if he'd have had a similar attrition rate to the champion Jackie Stewart. Peterson was untouchable in some parts of the year, but bad luck and retirements just wouldn't let him be. He stayed with Lotus in 1974 and took pole in Argentina before brake fade meant he finished 5 laps down in 13th, then was leading in Brazil before he got a puncture running over some glass that had been left on the track by over-exuberant spectators who had forced the race start to be delayed. He nonetheless finished 6th, then retired in Kyalami. He led early on in the Spanish Grand Prix, then as rain began to fall, lost his advantage to Ferrari's Niki Lauda before his engine failed only 3 laps after losing the lead. He then had a fuel leak from 5th on the grid in Nivelle Borla, then finally broke his season-winning duck in Monaco by taking victory with the fastest lap. He retired on home turf in Anderstorp, then was 8th in Zandvoort despite getting the fastest lap again. He won the first F1 race ever held on the Dijon-Prenois circuit, then finished 10th in Brands Hatch. 4th on the Nürburgring Nordschleife was followed by half-shaft failure in Austria, another win in Monza, 3rd in Mosport, and a retirement at the season finale in Watkins Glen with fuel system problems. In the 1973 and 74 seasons, Peterson took 10 pole positions, 4 fastest laps, and led 17 of the 30 races he entered, 6 of which he retired from a probable winning position. You could make a dead-on case for him to win the 1973 championship, and could theorise a triumph in 1974 too. This has to be one of the unluckiest stints I've seen in Formula 1 history. People talk about Kimi Raikkonen in 2005, Fernando Alonso in 2012, or Chris Amon's entire career, but the bad fortune Ronnie had in this 2-year period was beyond comical. 1975 was a lull year for Lotus as their 5-year-old car design, which was now an E-Spec model, only took the Swede to a best result of 4th place in Monaco, and only 2 other point scores in Austria and in the USA with 5th. He drove the 1976 season opener into Interlagos for Lotus, as Colin Chapman promised better results from the new 77 chassis, but Peterson moved back to March from round 2 onwards. However, he didn't score points until the 11th race in Austria where he was 6th, then he took pole in Zandvoort and led early on until he retired with oil pressure issues on lap 52. Then at Monza, driving a car that had previously had a best result of 4th, thanks to Hans-Joachim Stuck, Peterson won with fastest lap, taking his first victory since the 1974 race at the same venue. He failed to score in any of the final 3 rounds of 1976, and moved to Tyrrell for 1977, driving an evolution of the 6-wheeled P34 car. He retired from 5 of the opening 6 events, having spun off in Buenos Aires, collided with Jochen Mass and Clay Regazzoni in Interlagos, suffered mechanical problems in Kyalami and Long Beach, and had brake failure in Monaco. The only intervening finish was 8th in Spain. He took 3rd in a wet Zolder race, but didn't score in any of the next 6 rounds before taking 5th in Austria for the antepenultimate race of the year, and then the same result at the season-ending United States Grand Prix. Having won only 1 race in the previous 3 seasons, Peterson moved back to Lotus for 1978, driving the Ground Effect 79 chassis. He was 5th in Argentina, retired from pole in Yacarapagua, then took a last-lap victory in Kyalami from his old Tyrrell teammate Patrick Depailler. 4th in Long Beach preceded a retirement in Monaco, then he was 2nd to his teammate Mario Andretti in Zolder with fastest lap. 2nd in Spain came before a 3rd in Anderstorp and another runners-up finish in Paul Ricard. He took pole in Brands Hatch, but retired early on with a fuel leak, then led the opening laps of the German Grand Prix before eventually losing out due to gearbox failure. He took a near Grand Slam at the Österreichring before he was 2nd at Zandvoort. His recent results meant Peterson was only 12 points away from teammate Andretti, who was leading the driver's standings. There was a chance that if he won all of the final 3 races, with Andretti failing to finish in the runners-up spot in each, the Swede could take the crown. However, at the start of the next race in Monza, where Ronnie had so much success prior, the starter was over-enthusiastic in beginning the green light sequence to let the cars go, and thus several cars in the midfield and towards the back were still rolling while those at the front were stationary on the grid when the green flag was waved. This created a funnel effect going into the first chicane, and James Hunt, who was trying to avoid colliding with Riccardo Patrese, swerved and hit Peterson's car, which resulted in an accident that involved 7 more drivers. Ronnie's Lotus had struck the barriers hard and his car had caught fire, but Hunt, Clay Regazzoni and his ex-teammate Depailler pulled him out of the wreckage. He had only suffered minor burns and was still fully conscious, but had severe leg injuries. He and Vittorio Brambilla, who had been struck on the head by a flying wheel, were taken to hospital. While Brambilla made a full recovery and returned to F1 within a year, Peterson developed a fat embolism overnight in hospital after the accident and soon suffered from full kidney failure, passing away the morning after the race. He was 34. The Swede had won 10 races and finished runners-up in the driver's standings in 1971 and 78, but arguably his best period performance-wise was his first Lotus stint that had started in 1973. He could have possibly got the first double-digit race win total across the season in F1 history and potentially won at least 2 championships, but bad luck just stiffed him every time. It was his teammate Mario Andretti who had beat him to the title in 1978, but the American was also one of the rookie class of 1970. He was a jack-of-all-trades driver, competing in NASCAR, IndyCar, F1, sports cars, and probably many other disciplines, performing well in all. His surname is now synonymous with speed, and his sons and grandsons still compete in motorsports today. That's a lineage only matched by the likes of Fittipaldi and Earnhardt. In his first F1 start in the 1968 United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, he qualified on pole for Lotus, but retired from the race with clutch issues. That was his only start all year, and he stayed with Lotus for 1969, retiring from all 3 races he entered, scoring no points in Kyalami, the Nürburgring Nordschleife, or in Watkins Glen. Now you may be asking, why have you put him in a 1970 rookie class if he made his debut in 1968? Well, I think that considering he only competed in 4 races, or 5 entries if you include his non-start at the Italian race in 68, and he finished none of those races, I'd say he was inexperienced enough in F1 to count for this list. Signing on for the March team, 1970 saw him retire from the season-opening South African Grand Prix. Then, he picked up his first career podium in Spain with 3rd place. He missed the next 4 events in Monaco, Spa, Zandvoort and Sherrard, but did compete in the British race at Brands Hatch, the first F1 race at Hockenheim, and the first Austrian Grand Prix held on the Österreichring, although he retired from all 3 and didn't make any appearances for the rest of the year. He moved to Ferrari in 1971 and won the season opener in Kyalami, but retired in Montjuic Park, failed to qualify in Monaco, and retired again in Zandvoort. He missed the French and British Grand Prix, then finished 4th on the Nürburgring Nordschleife, before missing the races in Austria and Italy. He competed in the North American events in Canada and the United States at the end of the year, but was only 13th in the former and didn't start the latter. Ferrari were less competitive in 1972, and Mario competed in only 5 races, taking 4th place in the South African Grand Prix and 6th in Watkins Glen. He skipped the 1973 season entirely to focus on the USAC Championship in the States, but returned at the back end of 74, driving for the Parnelli team he did the American Series for. He was 7th in Canada and qualified 3rd at the Glen, but was disqualified for getting a push start from his team off the grid. He did his first full-time F1 campaign in 1975 with Parnelli, scoring his first points with the outfit of the 7th round in Anderstorp, then took 5th at the French Grand Prix 2 races later. 1976, though, saw him get his big F1 break with Team Lotus, picking up 2 podiums in Zandvoort and Mosport in the late season, as well as his second career win in Fuji to get 6th in the driver's standings. 1977 was a more fruitful year for Andretti, as after a paltry 5th in Buenos Aires and 2 retirements in Brazil and South Africa, he took 2 wins on the bounce in Long Beach and Jarama, then was 5th in Monaco, before 3 consecutive pole positions in Zolder, Anderstorp and Dijon saw him take another retirement, a 6th place, and a win at the French circuit. A barren stretch in the next 4 events saw a best finish of only 14th in Silverstone, but he won in Monza and took 2nd in Watkins Glen before struggling in Mosport and Fuji to round out the season. While 1977 was inconsistent, 1978 was Mario's year as he started off with a pole and victory in Argentina, 4th in Brazil, a lowly 7th in Kyalami and 2nd in Long Beach. After a dull 11th place in Monaco, he took consecutive wins from pole position in Zolder and Jarama, then retired in Anderstorp, won in France, retired again at Brands Hatch, then won from pole in Hockenheim. A retirement in Austria, followed by another triumph in Zandvoort, was followed by the tragedy of the Italian Grand Prix where Andretti's teammate Ronnie Peterson died following an accident on the first lap. Peterson's death mathematically sealed Andretti's title, and he failed to score any points in the final 2 races in the USA and Canada. Lotus fell off a cliff in terms of performance in 1979, and Andretti scored points only 5 times, getting 3rd in Jarama, 4th in Kyalami and Long Beach, and 5th in Buenos Aires and Monza. He scored only 1 point in 1980 at Watkins Glen, then moved to Alfa Romeo the year after, where he got 4th in Long Beach but failed to score any more points. He didn't begin the 1982 season driving for any team, but filled in for the recently retired Carlos Reutemann at Long Beach for Williams, although his performance was unspectacular. Then when Ferrari needed a late-season replacement for the injured Didier Pironi, Mario came to the help of the team, which he had last raced for in F1 10 years prior. At Monza, his first race weekend in over 5 months, he put his Ferrari on pole position at the ripe old age of 42, becoming the 4th oldest pole sitter in F1 history, a record which still stands today, and he was the oldest driver to start first since Jack Brabham in the 1970 Spanish Grand Prix. Mario finished 3rd that day, and at the season's final race in Caesars Palace, he outqualified teammate Patrick Tambay, but retired from the race with suspension issues. And that was the end of Mario's F1 career. He would race in IndyCar well into his 50s, then did sporadic Le Mans appearances, the last of which coming in 2000. He was one of the most adaptable drivers in an era where they did so many different series, maybe not so much in the latter part of his career, but definitely at the start. One of the guys who followed him to IndyCar following his F1 stint was, in my opinion, the best who was part of the 1970 rookie class. Emerson Fittipaldi started his F1 career in 1970, driving for Team Lotus at the British Grand Prix. He was put in the 3rd car behind team leader Jochen Rindt and number 2 John Miles. He would finish 8th on debut, then 4th at the German race on the Hockenheim circuit. After a 15th place in Austria at the old Österreich-Ring, the complexion of the season, and of F1 entirely, would change irrevocably. During practice for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, Rindt had a crash approaching the Parabolica corner, where he lost control at 200 miles an hour, and his car speared left into a stanchion head-on. Suddenly, Lotus had lost their number 1 driver and team leader. When John Miles also left the team, Fittipaldi was promoted to the number 1 role, alongside new recruits René Wissel and Pete Lovely. Out of respect for Jochen, the team didn't start the race in Monza, nor the one after in Canada, but when they came back for the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, Emerson won the race, his first win coming in his 4th Grand Prix start, with teammate Wissel in 3rd. The only other drivers I can think of who won this early on in their career are Giancarlo Baghetti, who won on his debut, Giuseppe Farina, who did the same in the first F1 race in 1950, and Jacques Villeneuve, who also won on his 4th start. He retired in the last race of the season in Mexico, having qualified last, putting him 10th place in the driver's standings on 12 points. 1971 saw typical Lotus reliability, as Emerson failed to make it to the end of 4 of the 11 races. Emerson also drove the experimental gas turbine engine car in Monza, finishing 8th. Points finishers wise, he finished 5th in Monaco, 3rd in Paul Ricard, and also finished 3rd in Silverstone, with his best result of the season coming at Austria with 2nd place. These 3 podiums put him 6th in the Drivers' Championship at the end of 1971. His 1972 season started with a retirement in Argentina, but he bounced back with a 2nd place in South Africa, then won in Jarama 3rd time out. He was now level with championship leader Denny Hulme, and he got his first ever pole position in Monaco and finished 3rd on the podium on race day. He followed that up with a near Grand Slam in Nivelles Ballers, getting pole in the win, leading almost all the laps. At the next race in Sherrard, Emerson finished 2nd in an event marred by problems caused by roadside stones which punctured tyres, and one flicked up by Ronnie Peterson hit Helmut Marko's helmet, penetrated his visor and blinded him in his left eye, halting his racing career. I wonder what he's doing today. It can't be anything special. Anyway, back to Emerson. He won next time out in Brands Hatch, putting him 16 points clear of 2nd place Jackie Stewart in the standings. He retired at the German Grand Prix on the Nordschleife, then won the race in Austria from pole. He won again in Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, and this result handed him the title with 2 races still to go. He didn't score any points in either of the final two events, but he still won the title on 61 points. Emerson started 1963 with 2 wins in Argentina, then won his home race, the first ever F1 Championship round that was known as the Brazilian Grand Prix. He finished 3rd in Kyalami, then won in Spain at Montjuic Park, then got 3rd in Zolder for the Belgian Grand Prix. However, his 2nd place in Monaco would be the last podium for another 6 races. Typical Lotus reliability, eh? He was leading the title race by 4 points to Jackie Stewart after Monaco, but only getting 1 point in 6 races from a 6th place in Germany is not the most surefire way to win a title. He had fallen to 3rd by the end of the Austrian Grand Prix, 24 points behind Stewart and 3 behind Francois Sever. This meant that it was possible, but not probable, that he could win the championship, but he'd need Jackie to score 2 points or less, and for himself to win all of the remaining races. Fittipaldi finishing 2nd in Monza guaranteed Stewart's title as he finished 4th. Fittipaldi would finish 2nd again in Mosport, and Francois Sever's death in qualifying for the United States season finale guaranteed Emerson his 2nd place finish in the driver's standings. For 1974, Fittipaldi switched over to McLaren, believing that they would be more competitive. He finished 10th in the first race in Argentina, but took the win from pole position in Brazil for the 2nd race of the season. A 7th place in South Africa was followed by a 3rd place in Jarama, and a win at the last race ever held at the Nivelle Borlas circuit. By this point, he led the drivers' standings by 1 point from Niki Lauda and 3 from Clay Regazzoni. After the races in Monaco and Sweden, which saw a 5th and 4th place respectively for Emerson, he was now 5 points clear of Regazzoni in 2nd. The race in the Netherlands saw Lauda and Regazzoni finished 1st and 2nd, with Fittipaldi in 3rd, moving both Niki and Clay to within 3 points of the Brazilian in the championship. Then Emerson retired from 3 of the next 4 races, although he got 2nd place in Brands Hatch in the race he didn't retire from. By the end of his stint of results, Emerson had dropped to 4th place in the drivers' standings, although he was within a win's point of Regazzoni in the lead. A 2nd place in Monza, followed by a win from pole in Canada, put Emerson and Clay on equal points going into the final race in Watkins Glen. For the race, they qualified 8th and 9th, with Emerson ahead by 0.062 seconds. During the race, Regazzoni couldn't climb higher than 11th by a race's end, which meant if Emerson got higher than 7th, he would become a 2-time world champion by the age of 28, a very young age to do such a feat at the time. He got 4th, meaning he outscored Regazzoni by 3 points in the end. He stayed with McLaren for 1975 and won the season opener in Argentina. The last time Emerson won the season opener, he finished runners-up in the title race, so we obviously hoped this wouldn't be a bad omen for the year. He finished 2nd in Brazil and was running 4th in South Africa before he got a cracked plug lead and finished not classified, 13 laps down. Nowadays, however, he would have been seen as retired, as back in the day, you only needed to complete 80% of a race to not be considered as retired from the race, whereas nowadays, this number is 90%. The next race was the infamous 1975 Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic Park. Many people were concerned by the fact that the crash barriers were not joined or bolted together correctly, and not at all in some places, among with other safety concerns. Emerson was one of a group of 3 drivers who refused to race with these abhorrent safety standards. He set a slow lap time in qualifying, then did not start the race. The other 2 drivers who withdrew were Arturo Mezzario, one of the drivers who would later pull Niki Lauda out of his burning Ferrari after his crash at the Nürburgring in 1976, and Emerson's brother Wilson also pulled out soon after the start. After that steaming disaster of a Grand Prix weekend, Emerson would finish 2nd in Monaco, keeping him in the championship lead, followed by Carlos Pache. However, after 3 consecutive non-point scores in Zolder, Anderstorp and Zandvoort, he fell behind Niki Lauda and Carlos Reutemann. A 4th place in Paul Ricard was followed by a win at the British Grand Prix. Emerson had won by a lap over Carlos Pache after a hailstorm caused many drivers to aquaplane into the barriers, and the race was red flagged as only a handful of cars were still running. 2 more non-point scoring finishes in Germany and Austria puts Emerson out of reach of the title, so I guess the first win in the season opener curse from earlier is real. He did, however, score a 2nd place in Monza and again at Watkins Glen to confirm his runners-up spot behind a fairly dominant Niki Lauda, who had won his first title. After having so much success over the first 5 years of his career in Lotus and McLaren, Emerson decided to move to a team set up by his brother the year prior, named eponymously as Fittipaldi Automotive. 1976 saw a massive fall from the grace of 2 titles and 2 runners-up spots, as Emerson only picked up 3 points from 3 6th place finishes in the US Grand Prix West at Long Beach, Monaco, and in Britain for the race at Brands Hatch. The season was so dire that Emerson even failed to qualify for the Belgian race at Zolder by 0.05 seconds. 1977 would see Emerson do better, as he opened the season with 2 fourth-place finishes in Argentina and Brazil, putting him 5th in the Drivers' Championship temporarily, and putting Fittipaldi in 5th place in the Constructors' Championship too. A 5th place at the 4th race in Long Beach kept Fittipaldi in 5th in the Constructors, although it took 9 more races for Emerson to score again, with his 3rd 4th place of the season coming in Zandvoort. Although the season was better points-wise, Emerson didn't qualify for the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim by 1.35 seconds, and by 0.46 seconds he had the same problem in Monza. In 1978, Fittipaldi's team got better. He got the team's first podium with 2nd place in the 2nd race of the season in Brazil, then the 2nd points finish of the season came in Sweden, as Emerson got 6th there as well. A late season performance upturn saw Emerson score points in 4 out of 5 races in a streak starting in Germany and ending in Watkins Glen in the US. 2 fourths in Germany and Austria were followed by 2 fifths in Zandvoort and in Watkins Glen, interspersed by an 8th in Monza. At the end of the season, Emerson finished 10th in the drivers' standings on 17 points, but it would be back down the order for 1979. He scored 6th and 1 point first time out in Argentina, but wouldn't score any more throughout the rest of the season. He did get 7th at Watkins Glen and 8th in Italy and Canada, but the measly 1 point put him 21st in the drivers' standings by the end of the year. In 1980, Emerson would return to the podium in Long Beach with a 3rd place finish, then got a 6th place in Monaco, totaling to 5 points across the season. He was also outscored by his teammate and future champion, Keke Rosberg, by 1 point. At the end of the season, however, Emerson retired from F1 at the fairly young age of 34. After a 4-year break from racing, he would go to IndyCar in 1984, staying until 1996, getting a championship win in 1989 and 2 other runners-up spots. It's a shame that Emerson retired from F1 as early as he did, as he was out of competitive machinery before he was 30, and had he stayed with McLaren, he could have been a 3-time champion, as he'd have probably won the title that James Hunt got in real life. That's all speculation though, and I think Emerson is the best driver of the 1970 rookie class, but it's still crazy to think how many great talents came to fruition and started performing well in the same year. 10 podium finishers, 6 race winners, and 5 championship potential drivers. 2 of them died before they could reach their full potential, those being Severe and Peterson, and Rolf Stommelen died in a sports car accident long after his F1 swan song. All of these drivers were good in their own right, but the sheer amount of talent coming in during 1 year is something I don't think we'll see in F1 again. Anyways, I think that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed me detailing the ins and outs of the rookie class of the 1970 F1 season, and if you did, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. Big shout out to my current Patreon subscribers Andy Lamberts and Eamon Al Dowdy, and if you'd like to simply support the channel and get early access to videos, you can join this list of lovely people by following the link in the description of the video. You can also follow my Instagram with the other link in the description if you'd like to see behind the scenes insights and other promotions. Anyways, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!